On February 9th of 2004, 21-year-old UMass student Maura Murray drove from her dorm in Amherst, Massachusetts to the White Mountains of New Hampshire.
At approximately 7:27 p.m., Maura spun out her 1996 Saturn on a hairpin turn on Route 112 in North Haverhill. There has never been a credible sighting of Maura since.
Maura is 5 foot 7 inches tall. She weighs 120 pounds, and she has brown hair and hazel eyes.
If you have any information regarding Maura's disappearance, please submit it to us,
The Murray family at MauraMurrayFamilyDirect@gmail.com.
or the New Hampshire State Police Cold Case Unit.
This is Missing Maura Murray. Welcome back to Missing Maura Murray. I'm Tim here today with Lance, being joined remotely. How's it going, Lance?
It is going pretty well, all things considered. How are you today, Tim?
Oh, just about the same, Lance. And in this episode, we speak to our friend, Michelle Kaszuba, who helps us with private investigations for the missing and so much more.
Kaszuba is the layman pronunciation, but the actual pronunciation is Kaszuba. She's a prosecutor, Tim, and she helps out a lot with providing us with information. And we feel it's important to have her on, and this is a second part of the interview, because what she's talking about is so layered, and we want to make sure that it is clearly communicated. And this is our way to gather this information from professionals in this field so we can better educate ourselves and educate the listeners, especially from a legal perspective when we discuss these types of subject matters.
Yeah, great call. And we discuss no body cases and why they may or may not be prosecuted. I think that's interesting when you look at Maura Murray's case or when you look at Alissa Turney's case.
Yeah, and we get these no body cases. Brianna Maitland is another one of those.
Yep.
Where what do you do? What do you do when you have all the other pieces in place that suggest a certain outcome, but legally you can't move forward with any prosecution unless other things start to fall in place?
Okay, so I hope you enjoy the episode. We will play it in just a moment. But before we do, we just want to remind you to check out all the shows on the Crawlspace Media Network. There are some new shows, like a new one from Nama Cates that's recently started airing called Escape Hate. And you are going to hear a promo for Bill Thomas's podcast called Mind Over Murder in this episode.
And do be sure to listen to this show because they have a great chemistry together, him and Kristen. And if you do follow Bill's work and you're a fan of him as he investigates the Colonial Parkway murders and his sister's murder connected to that case, you're going to love what they do on Mind Over Murder.
And Lance, on this date, April 2nd, 2010, 41-year-old Jeanette Du Priest disappeared from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She has not been seen or heard from since.
Jeanette is 5 foot 11 inches, 195 pounds, with blonde hair and brown eyes. She has several tattoos, a flower on the outside of her leg, the letters DOC on the right side of her neck. She has the words "Sexy Mama" above her right breast, and Irving with a rose on her back, and her name Jeanette on her arm.
Jeanette is a devoted mother of 8 children. She struggled with substance dependency in the past and managed depression with medication, which had been left behind. Anyone with information should contact the Philadelphia Police Department at 215-685-3252. Okay, so check out the links in the show notes, and thank you very much for listening. Stay safe. Welcome back to Missing Maura Murray. Michelle Kaszuba. How are you, Michelle?
Hi, guys. How you doing?
Oh, we are doing so well. We had such a good conversation with you the last time you came on, and we had to cut it short because we were going to keep going. I mean, we were probably slated for like 3 hours if we kept going. So we had to break it up, and it's great to get you back on to do part 2 here.
Yeah, and I'm happy to be here, of course.
Well, thanks for joining us. And one of the topics we wanted to discuss today was more than one way to look at a homicide case. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
There's a lot of people who are involved in not just the true crime community and, consuming all of these stories through podcasts, television, books, etc. There's also this great platform for crowd solving and citizen detectives. And considering the job that I have, I like to be able to, and I want to be able to educate people along the way as much as I can to try to debunk some of those myths that might come up or give people a new way to look at something or look at a case or a story. There's this myth out there that every homicide is a murder, that when you say homicide, it equals murder immediately. So actually, a homicide is defined as conduct that causes the death of a person. So think of homicide as the big umbrella, and under it comes murder, accidental death. But you can also have murder that's committed with a depraved heart, which is the heat of passion killing. They characterize it like that in our law school books. And an example is something like this. Man comes home, he finds his wife in bed with another person. He's enraged, he pulls out a gun, he kills them both right then and there. That's a depraved heart killing. There's also manslaughter, which falls under that umbrella of homicide. So that's characterized by a perpetrator who intends to seriously physically injure another person or recklessly injures another person. But instead of injuring that person, they kill them instead. So the culpability is different for an intentional, premeditated, depraved heart, reckless, or negligent murder.
I have a question. You made a reference to depraved heart. You said, is that like an actual legal term?
Some states will call it, murder with a depraved heart. It's kind of an antiquated term, or the heat of passion killing. Like in New York, that category of homicide and the subcategory of murder is encapsulated within the second-degree murder statute.
And that's a little bit more okay than planned murder?
I guess it's pretty safe to say that none of it's okay.
Okay, good.
No, but it's a different culpable mental state. There's
Right.
a murder that's committed, but what's the state of mind of the person that's actually committing it? There's a difference between someone that premeditates a murder. They put together their kill kit, or show up to a place with, a knife, a gun, zip ties, versus the person that walks in on a situation that causes that anger to rise to a point where the reaction that comes forth is very extreme.
And do you find that the people who commit those types of murders have more remorse, or is it about the same?
I think it's really hard to say. Every case and every person is different. You'll see some defendants, some convicted murderers who do have remorse, and you'll see others that don't. And I don't think I could say across the board that a person that commits a murder with a depraved heart could or would have more remorse than a person who premeditated murders.
Well, what about someone who commits a murder with a depraved heart because something happened in that relationship that sent them over the top, that escalated their anger, and they went into a rage, but they premeditated the murder of the person that they went into a rage over?
Is the question, do you think that person has more remorse, or are they more culpable than a person who doesn't premeditate a murder?
Okay, no, that's a good question. Would you think that they would have more remorse, or are they treated differently by the legal system? So I guess my question is, picture the scenario of a boyfriend who finds out that his girlfriend is cheating, and then he premeditates her murder. Technically, she did something that escalated his rage, and he ultimately killed this person. But is that considered the depraved heart scenario as well?
I wouldn't consider it a depraved heart scenario, because that would be a depraved heart murder it's something that it's a very quick reaction. It's you see something that triggers you and you snap. If you have that time for, the cooling off and the planning, then that takes that heat of passion, depraved heart kind of aspect out of it. And different states treat these kind of subsets of murder in different ways. Like for instance, in New York State, a premeditated, intentional murder with more than one victim, we treat that as a murder in the first degree. Whereas a depraved heart murder or an intentional murder of one person is considered murder in the second degree. And it's different subsections of the statutes. One thing to say to draw a difference between the premeditated, the intentional, and the depraved heart. That intentional murder is two people having an argument. One person pulls out a gun, shoots the gun, and the other person is killed. You intend to pull that gun out, you intend to pull the trigger, and you know that when you shoot at someone's chest, you're most likely going to kill them, right? The premeditated, going back to premeditated, is that planning stage. It is an intentional murder, but there's more planning that goes into it. And then you have that depraved heart, heat of passion killing, where there really isn't that time to think, it just happens. And those cases are very hard to prove. There's another subset of murder, of the murder statute in New York. These are very hard cases to deal with, and that's depraved indifference. So a depraved indifference case, I'll give you an example. I worked on a trial in Queens where there was a group of people who were having a baby shower, and my defendant and a few of his friends showed up. They were, it was a co-ed baby shower. There's men there, women there, young people, older people. And the defendant and his friends showed up, and they caused a bit of a scene. So the other gentlemen who were at this party, they threw them out of the party space. And so as they're going outside, like a fight erupts onto the sidewalk, onto the street. During this fight, there's this group of people, probably somewhere between 20, 30 people. The defendant breaks away from the crowd, gets into his car, makes a U-turn, drives up onto the sidewalk, and just runs the car through the crowd.
Oh my God.
He ends up seriously injuring two people and killing one young man who wasn't even involved in the fight.
Ugh.
And then he jumped out of his car and he fled. That's an example of depraved indifference, where you know that when he got behind that car, you have to know that that car is a weapon. And he drove that car through that crowd of people without any regard for who might be hurt or killed. And that's really hard to prove, because a lot of these culpable mental states, when you're talking about homicide as a whole, it has a lot to do with the evidence, and you're really trying to crawl into someone's head and prove to a judge or a jury, hey, this is what this person was thinking, and this is how I'm going to prove it. It's not easy.
Tell us about this Crawlspace example.
So when I first heard about Crawlspace's story, it came to mind to me as a really good example of something that I think is really important for the listeners of your podcast and our followers at PI for the Missing. And is that we have to be careful not to look at a death or disappearance and immediately rush to a verdict of murder when we think that something nefarious has happened. It's one thing to think that somebody was murdered, that someone was responsible for the death or disappearance of another person, but it's not always the case, and we do have to keep that in mind. So when I think about Kurt's story, if I remember correctly, this happened back in 1981, and he had been found outside after having last been seen allegedly at a party. And he was missing for several days, and then his body was found outside with no obvious signs of homicide. There wasn't, nobody saw a stab wound or a gunshot wound or, like blunt force trauma, anything like that. The way I looked at it was, you have to see where Kurt was last. And he was at a party with teenagers, people probably in their, mid to late teens, early 20s or so. And the situations that could happen in a gathering like that could lead to something that got out of control and then put Kurt in this situation and in his final resting place. So just to kind of break that down, when we see people in distress as human beings, we want to hope that somebody's going to help them. What I'm trying to say is, like, the average person, like, if something happened where, like, Kurt overdosed at a party, or, you know, he got into a fight or something and got knocked out and never woke up, that, like, especially young people are going to, you know, they're going to divert to self-preservation instead of calling for help, try to cover something up.
Are you saying that that's typical?
I can't say if it's typical. Spoken like a true lawyer, right? Just can't settle on one answer.
Commit to something.
But the point of this is when we start looking at these you know, unexplained disappearances and unexplained deaths, we immediately want to say, like, oh, this person was murdered. And sometimes, like, a lot of the times that is the case, and sometimes it's not. And in the situations where the person may be, you know, deceased without any obvious signs of homicide or murder, you know, like a gunshot wound or blunt force trauma or a stab wound or something, or a person's missing under what could be nefarious circumstances, immediately our minds go to, oh, something bad happened. Oh, this person was murdered. But there could be these other situations that happened where if a person's at a party and, you know, they overdose or they get punched and they get knocked out and they don't wake up, self-preservation takes over the people that are there. And instead of calling for help, they want to cover it up. It could have started as something that wasn't a homicide. It could have been an accident.
Right.
And then it becomes this situation where people start to cover up or tell a story or lie because they're afraid that their inaction is going to get them in trouble. They were engaging in activities that could be risky or unlawful or embarrassing, you know, as, for example, you know, using drugs or, you know, engaging in sexual acts with somebody, or they were, you know, doing something, or even just, you know, being mean to the person who ends up deceased. In the case of Kurt Stoker, if you have a bunch of people who are at a party, a bunch of young people at a party who are, you know, smoking marijuana or doing other kinds of drugs, and then if something happened to Kurt, everyone might be more worried that, you know, hey, I was doing drugs, I'm going to get in trouble for that. Let's just bring him outside and somebody will find him.
Right. We run into these examples when we talk about the Brianna Maitland case a lot. This kind of situation arises, and we've heard some rumblings, again, behind the scenes about this. So what you're saying is, if there was a death at a party and people sort of acted to cover something up and it wasn't a premeditated murder, you're saying that would be a different charge than murder in the first or something like that?
Oh, absolutely. I can give you a really good example of what I'm talking about. There was a case that I worked on, I think back in 2012 when I first came into homicide, and it was a young man. He was probably in his mid-20s, somewhere between 25 to 28 years old. He had 2 children. And he had a girlfriend that he was seeing on and off. He had gone to a party in an apartment building in Queens. It was a friend of his, a childhood female friend of his, and it was her birthday party. Handful of people are there. You know, our victim had substance dependency issues. You know, he drank, and he would drink to excess. And during the course of the party, the female friend's boyfriend got very, very mad at my victim and started punching him. So eventually, when the autopsy results came back, his blood alcohol level was more than twice the legal limit. So you're talking about a person that is very intoxicated, and he's getting punched to the point where he passes out. So what everybody at the party does is they drag his body out into the hallway and they leave him there, and they call 911, but they don't tell him his name. They don't tell him what's wrong. They just say, yeah, there's a guy just, you know, passed out in the hallway. He's taken to the hospital. He is nameless when he passes away, and his family finds out the following day. Fast forward to the autopsy. We're trying to figure out, you know, was this an overdose? Was it due to the alcohol consumption? Was there something else going on? Because there's no obvious signs of trauma on the outside of the body. When the medical examiner performed the autopsy, what she saw was there's, I believe it's an artery that runs up the neck into the head. And from being punched so violently, And from the level of his intoxication and, not being able to, stand up straight or, hold his body as straight as you'd want to in that state, the artery had tore, and that's what killed him. He basically internally bled out.
Okay, so that's a lesser charge, obviously.
We ended up charging him with manslaughter in the first degree. That's the intent to commit serious physical injury, punching somebody till they're knocked out, but instead cause death.
Yeah. Wow. Well, tell us about no body cases. And we come into this sort of topic a lot in the line of work we do in covering Maura Murray and speaking about some other cases too, like Alissa Turney. That is obviously probably a really good example of why there hasn't been any prosecution of Michael Turney, even though it seems really obvious what happened in Alissa Turney's disappearance.
So no body cases are classically some of the hardest cases for police and detectives to make an arrest on and for prosecutors to prove. And it's very frustrating because in a lot of these cases, the perpetrator is so obvious. You were just talking about, Alissa Turney's disappearance. The perpetrator is so obvious, but yet there's still no arrest. And it's very frustrating for the true crime community as well as the family.
Well, so what are some of the circumstances that any justice or there could be any prosecution in a no body case where everything else is so obvious?
There's two main ways that the detectives will bring evidence to a prosecutor, and the prosecutor will piece together these two different kinds of evidence. So the easy one is direct evidence. That's the fact-based evidence that is based upon the observation or the knowledge of a witness, an eyewitness. Eyewitness sees a defendant take a gun from her purse, shoot the victim. Criminalist observes a stain on the victim's shirt, swabs it for DNA, gets a hit in CODIS, right? Medical examiner performs an autopsy, recovers the bullet that killed the victim. Direct evidence. That's the easy stuff. No body cases, however, are based on circumstantial evidence, which is sets of facts and observations that when you take them all together and you examine them all together like a puzzle, creates this inference that the matter that's asserted, this person killed this victim, is true. So one of the examples that we give during jury selection, during the few trials that I've done, when we're talking about circumstantial evidence is this. Imagine a time when we were all allowed out of the house, right? It seems like it's years ago at this point.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know what outdoors is.
You leave your house, you get on the subway to go to work in the morning. You walk down to the underground station. As you're going downstairs, the sun was shining, everything was great. Now you're on the subway, you're traveling underground. You have a few stops to go until you reach your destination. And as the doors open, at the last couple stops, you see people entering the subway cars. They're shaking water out of their hair. They're carrying wet umbrellas. They're wearing raincoats and rain boots. So what are you able to figure out from that scene? That it's raining, right?
Yes, that it's raining outside.
You can't see the rain, though, because you're underground on the subway. But you take all those little pieces, the soggy people, the wet umbrellas, the raincoats, you piece it together in your mind, and you say, okay, that's what's happening. I am certain that it's raining. So that's circumstantial evidence.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Okay.
Right. Because, well, what else would it be? Could you say that it's circumstantial evidence that a fire hydrant came loose and sprayed a bunch of people?
Is it possible? Yes. But is it probable? Is it likely? Probably not.
Right. Gotcha. Okay, cool.
The most simple explanation is usually the one that is the most probable.
I go back and forth on that Occam's razor thing because people just they love to say it's Occam's razor 100% of the time.
Yeah, it's just a little too convenient sometimes. I don't think you can really use it in certain cases. Like we've talked about the Maura Murray case. I don't really know you can exactly use it.
Right.
Just like with anything, it's a case-by-case basis. Every single case, every story has its own very particular set of facts, and where there are some things that might be similar with other cases or different from other cases, you can't prescribe the same. You can't prescribe the same response to the case or theory to the case, right? As you would the one next to it, because they're all different.
Right, and you have to understand that there's a human element that goes into every single one of your cases.
And not just the human element of the victim.
Yeah, I don't know how you could get a distinct baseline in either one of those examples.
I don't think you can get a baseline anywhere.
Right.
because of the human element, like you just said. I mean, not just the human element of the victim, but also, the investigators, the prosecutor,
Yeah.
the natural elements of where the person disappeared from or where a body was found. There's too many things that are so personal and unique to each victim's story. And I've seen this in a lot of these cases where you can't try to fit everything into the same mold. If you do that, then you're just asking for trouble.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about, I know you probably didn't prepare for this, but can you tell us a little bit about Alissa Turney's case and why that one, in your opinion, hasn't gone to prosecution?
So when I look at no body cases, I have a few little checkpoints that I keep in mind as I go through, just to kind of guide me. Those checkpoints are there forensics? Is there a lack of forensics? What's fact and what's your gut feeling? And who is this person? Are they allowed to go missing? So starting with forensics, no matter what state or country you're in, to prove murder of any degree, you have to show that the victim died. You can show it through the direct evidence, or you can show it through the circumstantial evidence. When there's no body, how do you prove that murder? If you're examining a crime scene and it shows a massive amount of blood, and you have a pathologist that can testify and say, this amount of blood was here, a person could not survive that much bleeding without medical intervention, and you take that in conjunction with other circumstantial evidence, it makes a very compelling case for murder. For example, the Jennifer Doulos case. She was the mother of 5 who went missing in Connecticut very recently. Her husband was arrested based on circumstantial evidence back in January of 2020, I think, after authorities executed a search warrant on his home. In that case, they had a lot of puzzle pieces, a lot of circumstantial evidence, but a big part of it was they had a pathologist that was able to say, from the amount of blood that we found in various places, this person could not have survived without medical treatment.
Yeah.
So that pathologist was able to say, here's the blood, too much. I can say certainly that she's probably deceased. Now, if you turn back to Alissa's case, you don't have, from what I know, the forensics aren't there. If you don't have that indication that somebody had been seriously physically injured or hurt or killed in a space, then it's really hard to prove that the person is actually deceased.
Yeah.
Which brings me to the second point of, yeah, we all have a gut feeling that we know what happened, but your gut feeling isn't fact, that's not evidence. Instinct is one of the most powerful tools that we have as human beings. We get hunches. We have these nagging feelings, especially think of a mother who, when you watch these shows and stuff, you hear, the mother has this feeling in the pit of her stomach. There's something wrong. My son didn't come home.
Sure.
It's those things that we just know, but it's not evidence of a crime.
Quick question. What about a scene that has a little bit of blood, more or less like it looks to be something like a fight or a struggle occurred and there's no body, and do the two of those maybe come together as like something that you could say chances are this person did not survive? Or is it ultimately about the forensics?
The forensics play a part in it, but it's also the other pieces of the story and then other circumstantial evidence that brings it together. Going back to the example of the disappearance of Jennifer Doulos, not only did they have the blood evidence in the house and in other places, but they had surveillance video of, a car that was linked to her husband that was, seen at different places. And there were bags and other items that were thrown into different dumpsters around Hartford, Connecticut, I believe. And they were able to follow that surveillance video. It kind of reminded me of what myself and the detective did with Lionel Pickens homicide. Followed the surveillance video and saw where this car was going. And then when the police actually got to these different sites, were able to recover bags that were similar, were able to recover DNA off of those bags to say, okay, this person, her husband, was here. He touched this bag. He threw it in there. Her blood is on this bag as well. It's really hard to talk about Alissa's story because it's in a way, it reminds me of stories like, Susan Cox Powell and Natalie Holloway. These are people who we know who's responsible. We know that that something nefarious has happened to this sweet person, but how do you prove it? It doesn't mean that the perpetrator is infallible. If a jurisdiction has a case like Alissa's or Jennifer Doulos' case, or another, other victims who we've heard about a lot, like Susan Cox Powell, Natalie Holloway, it's up to that jurisdiction working within the confines of their judicial system and the laws of that state to determine if they have enough evidence to bring a case to trial. So what I'm saying is the different puzzle pieces for each case are going to be different shapes and sizes, and they're going to be different shapes and sizes in every state. With a homicide case, as with any crime in the United States, if you are acquitted, then you can't be tried again for the same crime. So you have to be sure that your circumstantial evidence is going to prove that this person killed this other person and hid his or her body beyond a reasonable doubt. Because if that person gets acquitted, then that's it. It's over.
Now, is the collection of DNA found at a crime scene considered circumstantial evidence? And what issues do you come across with any sort of a search and seizure for DNA?
Another one of the myths that I think surrounds true crime is that DNA is always going to be there to save the day. As circumstantial evidence or direct evidence, you won't always have DNA. Or what's even worse is that you have DNA but not enough DNA. So like a lot of the techniques that we talk about or that we're hearing about, like genetic genealogy, familial searching, touch DNA, they need different amounts of DNA in order to yield a successful profile or successful results. So when you're looking at disappearances or cold cases, by virtue of them being older or unsolved, you have to look at the evidence collection methods, or the lack thereof way back when. So
how much DNA is enough?
Yeah, I mean, we ran into this issue in the Maura Murray case, and in the Oxygen documentary, they said that the blood that was apparently on those wood chips was too deteriorated to get a full profile, and so it was mostly valueless. But how could that be different, I guess?
Let's think of DNA in terms of quality and quantity. So quantity is going to be affected by, is the DNA old and degraded? Because a degraded sample, you're going to have a lesser chance of getting a full profile. Was it contaminated, or was it DNA that was decomposing? Something like that. You're going to have a harder time getting, or no chance of getting, a full DNA profile or usable DNA profile out of DNA in that condition. And then on the other side, quantity, you need to have enough in order to make use of all of these new methods and scientific methods that we're seeing, like genetic genealogy, familial searching, touch DNA, things like that. So not only do you have to have quality DNA, but you also have to have enough in order to get that profile. And something that I learned about genetic genealogy early on after reading up on the Golden State Killer case was that you actually need a pretty large amount of DNA in order to make use of the genetic genealogy techniques, because you're not only pulling a full forensic profile, you're creating the entire genome. So in Golden State Killer case, what they had was an entire unopened rape kit from one of the victims that they were then able to directly compare to other samples that they were able to pull off of other cases. And that's almost like one of those 1 in a million type things that happens, and why it works so well for that case. But in other cases, going back to say, the case that I talked about in the last episode of, the murder of Christine Diefenbach, if you don't have enough DNA at the scene, if, they weren't collecting DNA in a certain way in 1988 that we would nowadays in 2020, I might not have enough DNA from that scene to create a full genome in order to make use of genetic genealogy. And if you want to talk about search and seizure issues, I think that there's a really, really big privacy debate that goes along with DNA, because DNA is touted as being so personal to each one of us, because it is. It's what makes us us. So it's what makes us all individuals. However, here's something that you have to think about when you're looking at familial searching and genetic genealogy and things like that. The Fourth Amendment gives us our privacy rights in our own stuff, our house, our car, our DNA. However, if I swab my cheek, I send it to 23andMe or Ancestry, and I decide I'm going to upload my profile into a public database, the only person that has a privacy interest in that DNA is me. So if one of my relatives goes out and commits a crime and a DNA profile is pulled from that scene, the police get that full genome and they have that full profile and they plug it into the public DNA database and they genealogically connect it to me. That relative who committed the crime can't go running to the court and say, hey, that's not fair, because they don't have any privacy ownership in my DNA.
Because they don't own your DNA. It's not like you have a joint lease with just because they're your relative, you don't jointly own your DNA. That is your decision, right?
And that's a legal concept that we learned that's called standing, and it works in everything, not just DNA.
What if you opposed that so your family member, in the hypothetical scenario, your family member commits this crime, and then I guess my question is, would you be able to say, I think that this is unreasonable search and seizure, looking into like acquiring my DNA?
Only if I'm arrested for the crime. Like an outside citizen, an ordinary citizen can't claim a Fourth Amendment privilege in their DNA that convicts somebody else, because it surrounds your constitutional rights of being accused of a crime. So if I'm not on trial, I can't oppose my DNA being used in the criminal arena. Only the person who's on trial can try to claim a Fourth Amendment right to the evidence that's being presented against them. But it's my DNA and the defendant doesn't own it, so he can't claim a right. Like one of the ways this comes up that's a little bit more tangible is car stop. Only person in the car gets pulled over for a traffic violation. Police officer says, can I have your license, registration? Is this your car? And the person in the driver's seat says, no, it's my cousin's car, or it's my sister's car. And then at that point, police officers search the car and they find drugs in the car, or they find a gun in the car. And once we go to a hearing and the defendant starts saying, there isn't, you couldn't go in that glove compartment because, I have standing, I have a privacy interest in this car. As the prosecutor, I turn around and say, well, you told us that this wasn't your car. We looked at the registration and it belongs to your sister. So you don't have any privacy interest in this car right now. That's my argument.
Why don't you talk a little bit about your work with private investigations for the missing? I think a lot of people already know that you have a big hand in that. You're on the board, and you also are very involved with the blog. And you want to chat a little bit about the blog from Private Investigations for the Missing?
Yeah, I do, because I really want, a lot of your listeners, just everybody, to go check out the blog. I'm sure that you guys will probably post the website in the show notes. And if you don't already have the website, like in your saved favorites on your browser, then you should totally do that right now. Because usually a couple times a week we post up on the blog. One of the things that we enjoy is the podcast spotlight, where we get to interview a lot of really amazing podcasts, a lot of podcasts who, people who are friends of the show and, who are pretty popular in the podcast sphere, like Laura Norton from The Fall Line and Robin Warder from Terrell Went Cold. They contributed to us. And, you get to also look into, some newer podcasts that you might not have heard of or want to learn more about. So you see, like Melissa from Victimology and, Naptime Nancy and her podcast. Like everybody kind of, they get into, what makes them, what got them into podcasting, what their passion cases are, things like that. And another part of the blog is our missing persons profile. So they're a little bit longer than the On This Date series. And, some of them I write, some of them are written by other friends of the show, like Sarah Kaline and Chris Duet. And it profiles, cases in more detail to try to get everyone acquainted with the actual person who's missing and not just the circumstances of their case. And lastly, we have informational type pieces. Lou Barry, who's done a ton of excellent work with Brianna Maitland's investigation. He writes a lot of pieces on private investigating and investigations in general that are really helpful for understanding the stuff that he does. I've been trying to write some more on the law and investigative end of it. I'm putting together with Jillian, like a small series on the no body cases, things like that. So if any of my explanations came across unclear, hopefully my writing will be better. But I urge everybody to check it out. We do a recommended reading every week. If you're a podcaster or a blogger or a PI or a law student, or you have a case, if you have a case that you're working on that needs some attention, or you want to talk about your podcast and your passion case, email us at piftmblog@gmail.com, and we'll set you up with something and get you on our blog too.